We assume that a life of infinite wealth must also be a life of infinite happiness. But what if the grandest halls are also the loneliest? What if the heaviest burden a woman can carry is not poverty, but a diamond tiara worn in an empty room? Today we delve into such a life, a story that unfolds at the absolute pinnacle of the British aristocracy, a world of dukes and duchesses, of royal confidants and unimaginable fortunes. Our subject is a woman who possessed a name that echoed through the corridors of power and a beauty that graced the pages of every society magazine. Loelia, Duchess of Westminster. She was the third wife of the richest man in Britain, a man so wealthy he was often compared to a king. She lived in a fairy tale complete with castles and yachts and private islands. But this is not a fairy tale. It's the story of what happens when the dream becomes a cage, a gilded prison of protocol and expectation. It's the story of a woman who socialized with the royal family, who danced with princes, who was whispered about by the great literary provocateur Truman Capote, and yet who confessed to a profound and aching solitude. This is the story of the diamonds, yes, but more importantly, it's the story of the tears they hid. This is the real life of Loelia Ponsonby, the woman who became a duchess but had to fight for the right to simply be herself. To truly understand the cage Loelia was born into, long before she stepped into the one she married into, we have to travel back in time, not just to a different year, but to a different world, a world stitched from silk and secrets, governed by unspoken rules as rigid and as strong as the whalebone corsets worn by its women. We begin in the twilight of the Victorian era and the dawn of the Edwardian age, a period of immense contradiction. Britain was the heart of a global empire, a powerhouse of industry and influence, yet its society was stratified into a class system as intricate and unforgiving as any ancient caste. At the very top of this pyramid was the aristocracy, a class of people who didn't just have money, they were the money. Their wealth was ancient, tied to vast tracts of land granted to their ancestors by long-dead kings. It was a world where your surname meant more than your character, and your lineage was your destiny. This wasn't the new money of American industrialists, seen as rather vulgar and brash. This was old, landed, and deeply entrenched power. Life for this class revolved around two distinct poles: the country estate, a sprawling fiefdom with its armies of tenants and servants, and the London season. The season was a 6-month-long ritual, an elaborate high-stakes marriage market disguised as a series of parties. From April to August, the great aristocratic families would abandon their country seats and come up to their palatial London townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia. For young women of Loelia's class, this was their purpose. From the moment they were born, they were groomed for it. They learned French, piano, and watercolor painting not for personal enrichment, but to become accomplished and desirable wives. Their coming out, their presentation at court to the king and queen, was the starting gun. From that moment on, their lives became a whirlwind of balls, dinner parties, race meetings at Ascot, and regattas at Henley. Every curtsy, every dance, every polite conversation was freighted with meaning. Mothers, with the strategic cunning of generals, maneuvered their daughters into the paths of eligible bachelors. And eligible had a very specific definition. He had to have a title, land, and a respectable lineage. Love was a fortunate coincidence, a welcome bonus, but it was certainly not the primary objective. The objective was to make a good match, to secure the future of one's family, and to produce an heir and a spare to carry on the name. For a young woman to fail to secure a proposal by the end of her second or third season was considered a quiet catastrophe. dooming her to the pitiful fate of spinsterhood. This system placed immense pressure on young women, teaching them that personal desires were secondary to duty and pragmatism. Valuing decorum above all, it considered any show of excessive emotion poor form, a sign of weak breeding. Life was a performance of keeping up appearances, maintaining a stiff upper lip, and never letting the mask slip. Into this highly controlled, emotionally sterile environment, Loelia Ponsonby was born in 1904. And her family wasn't just part of this world, they were at its absolute epicenter. The Ponsonbys were the quintessential courtier family. They didn't just serve the monarchy, they were woven into the very fabric of its existence. Her grandfather, Sir Henry Ponsonby, was the famously discreet and indispensable private secretary to Queen Victoria for nearly 25 years. He was the Queen's gatekeeper, her confidant, the man who managed her correspondence and guided her through the political intricacies of her long reign. Loelia's father, Frederick Ponsonby, known to all as Fritz, followed in his father's footsteps. He served as an equerry to Queen Victoria, then became assistant private secretary to King Edward VII, and later keeper of the privy purse for King George V. Think about what that means. The privy purse is the sovereign's private income. Fritz Ponsonby wasn't just a courtier. He was the king's personal finance manager, his trusted advisor, the man who handled the most intimate details of the royal family's life. Growing up as Fritz Ponsonby's daughter meant that Loelia's childhood was lived in the shadow of palaces. Her homes were grace and favor apartments at St. James's Palace and houses on the royal estates of Sandringham and Balmoral. Her playmates were not the children of the local gentry. They were at times the royal children themselves. She grew up seeing the king and queen not as distant, godlike figures, but as her father's employers, as people who came for tea. This proximity to the crown instilled in her a deep, almost cellular, understanding of protocol, discretion, and the immense unbridgeable gap between public duty and private feeling. She learned from a very young age that one simply did not speak of personal troubles. One did not complain. One smiled, one curtsied, and one carried on. This upbringing was also profoundly isolating. In households of this stature, children were largely raised by a flotilla of nannies, governesses, and tutors. Parents were often distant figures, seen for a brief, formal hour in the evening before bedtime. Loelia's relationship with her own parents was emblematic of this. Her father, Fritz, was a man consumed by his royal duties, a quintessential courtier who was witty and charming in public, but often remote and preoccupied at home. Her mother, Sia, was a society beauty who, by many accounts, was not temperamentally suited to the rigid confines of court life, and whose marriage to Fritz was not a particularly happy one. This created a home atmosphere that was polite and orderly, but cool and lacking in overt affection. Loelia found her companionship not in warm family embraces, but in books and in the quiet, solitary world of her own imagination. She became an observer, a watchful and sensitive child who learned to read the subtle currents of emotion in a room, precisely because they were so rarely spoken aloud. As she grew into a young woman, the world around her was beginning to change. The First World War had ripped through Europe, decimating a generation of young men, including many of the heirs to these great aristocratic families. The war acted as a brutal catalyst for social change. The old certainties were shaken. Women had worked in factories and on the land, tasting a new kind of independence. The rigid class structure, while still powerful, was showing its first cracks. The 1920s roared in, bringing with them jazz music, shorter hemlines, and a new, almost frantic pursuit of pleasure, embodied by the generation of bright young things. This was the generation of young, often titled socialites who rebelled against the stuffiness of their parents' Edwardian world. They threw scandalous bottle parties, organized elaborate treasure hunts through London, and were relentlessly chronicled in the gossip columns of newspapers like the Daily Mail and Tatler. They were flamboyant, witty, and determined to live life to the fullest, as if to erase the trauma of the war. Loelia, by virtue of her age and social standing, was on the periphery of this set. She was presented at court, she attended the balls, she did the season, just as she was expected to, but she was never truly one of them. She was too quiet, too introspective, too steeped in the old-world courtiers' sense of propriety to fully embrace their wild abandon. She was a woman caught between two worlds, the formal, duty-bound tradition of her parents' generation and the dazzling, chaotic modernity of her own. She was beautiful, intelligent, and impeccably connected. By all the metrics of her time, she was one of the most eligible young women in England. And then he appeared in her life. A man who wasn't just an eligible bachelor, he was the ultimate prize. A figure of almost mythical wealth and power, a man who could offer a young woman not just a title, but a kingdom. He was Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, known to the world simply as Bendor. And his arrival on the scene would take Loelia's carefully constructed, quietly ordered life and turn it irrevocably into the very fairy tale that would become her prison. The stage was set, the players were in place, and for the quiet, observant girl from St. James's Palace, the curtain was about to rise on the most spectacular and devastating performance of her life. If the British aristocracy was a mountain range, Hugh Grosvenor, the second Duke of Westminster, was its Everest. He wasn't merely a duke, he was an institution, a force of nature, a man whose wealth and influence were so vast they defied easy comparison. To understand the world Loelia was about to enter, you first have to understand the man who ruled it with absolute authority. His nickname, Bendor, was a story in itself, a fusion of two pillars of his family's identity. The first part, Bendor, was the name of his grandfather's legendary Derby-winning racehorse. The second, Or, came from the golden wheat sheaf, the garbor in heraldic French, that adorned the Grosvenor coat of arms. The name itself spoke of sporting victory and ancient golden wealth, and that wealth was simply staggering. The Grosvenors didn't just own a few grand houses. They owned the very ground beneath London's most exclusive districts, 100 acres of Mayfair, 200 acres of Belgravia. Every time a lease was signed, a shop was opened, or a house was sold in these ultra-prime locations, a portion of the profit flowed into the Westminster coffers. His income was estimated at a guinea a minute, more than £1 every 60 seconds, day and night, in an era when a skilled worker might earn £2 or £3 in a week. This fire hose of money funded a lifestyle of almost Caligulan excess. His primary country seat, Eaton Hall in Cheshire, was not so much a house as a Gothic principality, a colossal Victorian palace of towers, spires, and endless corridors. It was so large that a miniature railway had been built to transport guests and goods around its vast estate. He owned great houses in Scotland and a villa in the south of France, the Villa La Pausa, which he would later build for his lover, Coco Chanel. He owned a fleet of cars, a stable of winning racehorses, and, most famously, his yachts. These weren't pleasure boats, they were floating palaces. The Flying Cloud was a magnificent four-masted schooner, while the Cutty Sark was a converted naval destroyer, both staffed by enormous crews, ready at a moment's notice to sail to any port in the world his whim desired. but it was the man himself who was most formidable. Bendor was possessed of a restless, ferocious energy. He had been a decorated soldier, earning the Distinguished Service Order for his daring exploits in the Boer War, where he famously drove an armored train deep into enemy territory. He was physically imposing, charming when he chose to be, and exuded an aura of raw power and unshakable self-belief. His circle of friends included the most powerful men of the age. Winston Churchill was a frequent guest and a close confidant for many years. To be in Bendor's favor was to be bathed in the warm glow of his immense charisma and legendary generosity. He would think nothing of giving a friend a priceless jewel or forgiving a massive debt on a whim. However, beneath the charismatic surface lay a character of terrifying flaws. His temper was volcanic and unpredictable. He was deeply autocratic, believing his wealth and title gave him the right to behave exactly as he pleased, with no regard for the consequences or the feelings of others. He was notoriously restless, quickly growing bored with people, places, and, most notably, wives. And he harbored ugly prejudices, including a virulent anti-Semitism that would become more pronounced as he aged. By the time he met the 19-year-old Loelia Ponsonby, the 44-year-old Duke was already a two-time veteran of the marital battlefield. His first wife, Constance Cornwallis West, had given him 2 daughters and a son, but the son and heir tragically died at the age of 4. The marriage, starved of affection and blighted by his constant infidelity, ended in a bitter divorce. His second marriage to Violet Nelson was even shorter, a brief and tempestuous affair that quickly fizzled out. He had a well-established pattern, an intense, all-consuming courtship, followed by a period of possessive obsession, which would inevitably curdle into boredom, neglect, and finally, outright cruelty. He was, in short, a serial husband, constantly searching for a new woman to be the perfect decorative centerpiece for his magnificent life. Into this predator's orbit swam the lovely, gentle, and utterly inexperienced Loelia Ponsonby. Their courtship was a whirlwind, a textbook example of Bendor's method. He showered her with attention and gifts of breathtaking extravagance. For a young woman from a background that, while close to the crown, was one of professional service, rather than vast spendable wealth, it must have been intoxicating. He didn't just send flowers, he sent lorry loads of them. He didn't just give jewelry, he bestowed upon her historic diamonds, including pieces from the French crown jewels and the legendary Arcot diamonds, a pair of flawless stones with a history stretching back to the 18th century. He swept her into his world of exhilarating speed and luxury. One moment they would be dining in London, the next they would be speeding through the night in one of his Rolls-Royces to board a yacht for a spontaneous trip to Paris. To a 19-year-old, this powerful, worldly man must have seemed like a god. He was decisive, exciting, and utterly focused on her. Her quiet, reserved family could only watch with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Her father, Fritz, a man who understood the nuances of character, harbored deep reservations. He knew the Duke's reputation, he knew of his rages, his womanizing, his fundamental instability. But how could he stand in the way of what was, by every conceivable societal standard, the most brilliant match of the decade? To refuse the Duke of Westminster was almost unthinkable. And so, in February 1930, they were married. The wedding was a spectacle, the society event of the year. St. Martin-in-the-Fields was mobbed with onlookers, all desperate for a glimpse of the girl who had captured Britain's richest duke. Loelia was, for that one day, the envy of every woman in England. She was now Her Grace, the Duchess of Westminster, mistress of Eaton Hall, and the new queen of Bendor's vast empire. The fairy tale had officially begun. The tragedy was that, for Loelia, the wedding day was the fairy tale's final happy chapter. The reality of her new life crashed down on her almost immediately. Arriving at Eaton Hall was not like arriving at a home. It was like being installed in a museum. The sheer oppressive scale of the place was dehumanizing. Hundreds of rooms, miles of corridors, all kept in a state of unnerving perfection by an army of servants who moved with silent, ghostly efficiency. There was a butler, an under-butler, a groom of the chambers, 3 footmen, a housekeeper, a head housemaid with 14 maids under her, a chef with a full kitchen brigade, and countless others. It was a machine designed to run for the comfort and pleasure of one man. The Duke, Loelia, at just 19, was supposed to be the chatelaine, the mistress of this domain. But she quickly found she had no real authority. The staff, many of whom had been there for decades, were loyal only to Bendor. They took their orders from him. Her attempts to make small changes or to introduce a slightly more relaxed atmosphere were met with polite but firm resistance. As a mere figurehead in her own home, expected only to exist beautifully within it, Loelia later wrote of a soul-crushing loneliness, of feeling like an uninvited guest while wandering through its endless perfectly polished rooms. Bendor's initial ardor soon cooled, replaced by a casual, almost indifferent proprietorship. He treated her like his most prized possession, to be displayed at dinner parties and adorned with his jewels, but her own thoughts, feelings, and interests were of no concern to him. His life continued as it always had, a relentless series of house parties filled with his own friends. Loelia was expected to be the perfect, ever-smiling hostess, to make polite conversation with politicians, industrialists, and foreign dignitaries, and then to disappear gracefully when the men retired for their port and cigars. It was in the small private moments that the true nature of his character revealed itself. One of the most telling and heartbreaking stories from this period involved her beloved pug, Pongo. In the cold, formal expanse of Eaton Hall, this little dog was a source of warmth, a living creature that offered her the simple, unconditional affection she craved. Loelia adored him. Bendor, however, despised small dogs. He found Pongo yappy and irritating. One afternoon, in a fit of pique over some minor annoyance, he picked up the little dog, walked to the window of their second-floor sitting room, and threw him out. By some miracle, Pongo landed in a soft shrubbery and survived, shaken but physically unharmed. But the act itself was a piece of calculated psychological violence. It was a brutal, terrifying demonstration of his power and her utter powerlessness. It sent a clear and chilling message: nothing you love is safe from me. I control this world, and I can destroy anything in it or anyone in it on a whim. It was an act of terror designed to break her spirit, and it was a wound from which her trust in him would never recover. Compounding her misery was the immense, unspoken pressure to produce an heir. Bendor was obsessed with securing the Grosvenor lineage. His first marriage had failed to provide a surviving son. He now looked to his young, healthy new wife to do her duty. Every month that passed without a pregnancy was a source of mounting tension. The matter was discussed with doctors, and the failure was, of course, assumed to be hers. It became another stick with which Bendor could beat her, another inadequacy he could point to. He would make cruel remarks in front of guests, lamenting his lack of a son, placing the blame squarely and publicly at her feet. The bitter irony, which would only be discovered years later, was that a bout of orchitis in his youth had likely left Bendor himself sterile. But in the 1920s, the fault for a childless marriage was laid entirely upon the wife. This failure, which was completely out of her control, became the ultimate justification in his mind for his own appalling behavior. His disappointment festered, and soon he began to look elsewhere for comfort and for sport. The doors of the gilded cage were now locked, and the Duke's wandering eye signaled the beginning of a new and even more humiliating chapter of her ordeal. The failure to produce a son and heir was the key that Bendor used to unlock his own worst impulses. In his mind, Loelia had failed in her primary, and perhaps only, duty. This perceived failure granted him the moral license to abandon any pretense of marital fidelity. His affairs, which had likely been a feature of their marriage from the beginning, now moved from the shadows into the full, unapologetic glare of the public eye. What followed was not merely a private heartbreak for Loelia. It was a prolonged and exquisitely public humiliation, orchestrated by a man who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in demonstrating his absolute power over her. And the woman who would come to define this era of Bendor's life was no mere dalliance. She was, in her own right, as formidable and iconic a figure as he was. Her name was Gabrielle Coco Chanel. Chanel was everything Loelia was not. Where Loelia was quiet, Chanel was fiercely outspoken. Where Loelia was a product of ancient lineage and tradition, Chanel was a self-made titan, a woman who had clawed her way up from an impoverished, orphan childhood to the absolute pinnacle of global fashion. She was a revolutionary who had liberated women from the corset, championing a style that was elegant, modern, and comfortable. She was a businesswoman of shrewd intelligence, an artist of singular vision, and a woman who was entirely her own creation. She was Bendor's equal in temperament, imperious, charismatic, and utterly convinced of her own genius. Their affair was not a tawdry secret. It was a grand passion, a meeting of two larger-than-life personalities, and they conducted it on an international stage. Bendor was utterly captivated by her. He lavished upon her the kind of gifts that made headlines. He gave her priceless jewels, including a spectacular river of diamonds. He bought her a townhouse in London's prestigious Mayfair. Most significantly, on the French Riviera, he purchased a plot of land at Roquebrune-Cap-Martin and instructed an architect to build a villa to Chanel's exact specifications. The result was Villa La Posa, a masterpiece of understated elegance that became Chanel's southern sanctuary and a playground for their glittering social circle. While Bendor was building a palace for his mistress in France, his wife Loelia was left to rattle around the cavernous, gloomy halls of Eaton Hall in Cheshire. The contrast could not have been more brutal. Chanel was getting a home built from love and passion. Loelia was a prisoner in a mausoleum built of duty and disappointment. The psychological torment of this situation is difficult to overstate. She was the Duchess of Westminster, and yet the whole of London and Paris society was whispering about her husband's affair with the famous French couturière. Friends would return from the Riviera with breathless accounts of the parties at La Pausa, of Chanel holding court, with Bendor beaming at her side. Every newspaper gossip column, every society magazine, was filled with thinly veiled references to their relationship. Bendor made little effort to hide it. He would spend weeks, sometimes months abroad with Chanel, leaving Loelia entirely alone. His instructions for the running of his English estates would arrive by telegram from France. Loelia was expected to maintain the facade, to continue her duties as Duchess, to host his friends and manage his households, all while knowing that his heart, his attention, and his vast fortune were being poured into another woman. It was a masterclass in psychological cruelty. He wasn't just being unfaithful, he was actively erasing her, replacing her in the most glamorous arenas of his life while still demanding she perform her role as the dutiful, invisible wife back home. How does a person survive such an ordeal? Faced with a situation from which in her era there was no easy escape, Loelia did not simply crumble. Instead, with a quiet resilience forged in the emotionally cool fires of her upbringing, she began to build a life for herself within the ruins of her marriage. She created a world of her own, a fortress of the mind, where she could cultivate beauty and find a measure of peace. Her most famous refuge was her art. She channeled her frustrated creative energies and her yearning for order into the meticulous creation of dollhouses and miniature scenes. These were not children's toys, they were exquisite works of art, perfectly scaled worlds where everything was harmonious and within her control. In a life of chaotic emotions and powerlessness, the precision required to craft a miniature Chippendale chair or to arrange a tiny library offered a profound sense of therapeutic focus. She would spend countless hours lost in these miniature worlds, each one a silent rebellion against the sprawling, unmanageable grandeur of her real life. While Bendor was sailing the Mediterranean with Chanel, Loelia was creating small pockets of perfection, worlds where she was the architect and the master, not the prisoner. She also began to assert her own aesthetic taste in the grand houses she was supposed to command. While Bendor's preference was for heavy, dark baronial splendor, Loelia was drawn to the lighter, more elegant styles of the 18th century. She couldn't redecorate Eaton Hall, which Bendor considered sacrosanct, but in their other smaller properties, like her personal sitting room in their London house, Borden House, she began to make her mark. She became a knowledgeable collector of fine furniture and porcelain. This was more than a hobby. It was a way of carving out a physical space that reflected her own identity, not her husband's. It was a declaration that, despite being the Duchess of Westminster, she was still Loelia Ponsonby, a woman of taste and refinement in her own right. Perhaps most importantly, she cultivated her own circle of friends. She had little in common with Bendor's robust, hard-drinking political set. She found her tribe among the more artistic and bohemian figures of the time. The brilliant, witty photographer and designer Cecil Beaton became a close friend. His photographs of her from this period are incredibly revealing. He didn't just capture the elegant duchess in her pearls and satin. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet melancholy behind the perfect smile. Through friends like Beaton, she found intellectual stimulation and genuine companionship, a world away from the stultifying formality of her official life. These friendships were a lifeline, reminding her that there was a world outside the gilded cage, a world where she was valued for her intelligence and her gentle character, not just her title. But these coping mechanisms could only do so much to blunt the pain of her public role. The affair with Chanel eventually cooled, as all of Bendor's passions did, but it was simply replaced by others. The production line of mistresses was continuous. The most humiliating moments were when Bendor's two worlds collided. He would sometimes invite his mistresses to house parties at Eaton Hall, expecting Loelia to act as the gracious hostess. Can you imagine the sheer, excruciating performance that required? To welcome a woman into your home, knowing she is sleeping with your husband, to direct the servants to see to her comfort, to sit opposite her at the dinner table and make polite conversation, all under the watchful eyes of guests who knew the entire sordid story. It was a trial by fire, a test of social endurance that few could have passed. Loelia, conditioned from birth by the courtier's creed of never show, never tell, somehow managed it, but the cost to her spirit was immense. There is an anecdote that perfectly captures the absurdity and the pathos of her situation. Bendor had taken up with a new favorite and, in a fit of generosity, had given the woman one of Loelia's own diamond bracelets. Sometime later, Loelia was at a society function and saw the woman wearing it. A friend, outraged on Lelia's behalf, whispered, "Look, she's wearing your bracelet." Loelia, with the world-weary grace that had become her armor, simply replied, "No, my dear, it's my husband, but it's her bracelet now." That single sentence speaks volumes. It reveals a woman who had come to a place of grim acceptance, a woman who had learned to compartmentalize her life in order to survive. She was no longer a naive girl. She was a veteran of a long and painful emotional war. The constant betrayals and humiliations had forged in her a kind of detached, observational quality. She was living in one of the most extraordinary situations imaginable, at the very center of wealth and power, but she was also an outsider within it, a witness to its excesses and its hypocrisies. Unbeknownst to her, this quiet observation, this cataloging of slights and absurdities, was turning her into a unique chronicler of her class, a skill that, many years later, would make her a fascinating source for a writer who specialized in the secret lives of the rich, Truman Capote. The foundations of her story were being laid not in headlines, but in the quiet, unseen suffering behind the palace walls. The years were ticking by, and the smiling mask of the Duchess was becoming harder and harder to hold in place. By the mid-1930s, the marriage of the Duke and Duchess of Westminster had ceased to be a battlefield of passionate conflict and had entered a long, cold, and bitter armistice. The emotional war was over not because peace had been declared, but because one side had been so thoroughly defeated and ground down that she had retreated into a state of quiet, internal exile. Loelia and Bendor were no longer husband and wife in any meaningful sense. They were two actors locked in a dreary, long-running theatrical production, playing their public roles with a weary professionalism while living entirely separate lives behind the scenes. Bendor's philandering was no longer a shocking betrayal. It was a permanent and predictable feature of their existence, as routine as the changing of the seasons. The succession of mistresses continued, each one a fresh, stinging reminder of Loelia's own status as a beautiful but ultimately discarded piece of property. Her life became a carefully managed performance of being a duchess. She would glide through her official duties on autopilot, opening bazaars, attending charity committees, hosting endless dinner parties for Bendor's friends, all with a serene and impenetrable grace. This grace was her armor, a shield of perfect manners and decorum that protected the shattered woman within. She had learned that the only way to survive in the cage was to become as elegant and as inanimate as its golden bars. Adding to her profound personal unhappiness was a growing sense of moral disgust. As the 1930s wore on and the storm clouds of war gathered over Europe, Bendor's politics took a dark and ugly turn. Possessed of a colossal ego and a simplistic, autocratic view of the world, he became increasingly sympathetic to the rising fascist powers in Germany and Italy. He was a prominent member of right-wing pro-German societies in Britain, joining figures like Lord Londonderry in a misguided belief that Hitler was a bulwark against communism and a man with whom Britain could do business. His notorious anti-Semitism, once a private prejudice, became more pronounced in public. For Loelia, a woman raised in the heart of the British establishment, a world built on tradition, duty, and a deep-seated patriotism, this was abhorrent. She was now shackled not just to a cruel and unfaithful husband, but to a man whose political sympathies she found repellent. The chasm between them was no longer just emotional, it was ideological. She was living in the house of a man who entertained Nazi sympathizers, a man who represented a betrayal of the very values she had been brought up to revere. The gilded cage had not only imprisoned her, it had become morally toxic. Then in September 1939, the world changed forever. The declaration of war against Germany shattered the fragile peace of Europe and rendered the frivolous, self-obsessed world of the British aristocracy instantly and irrevocably obsolete. The London season was cancelled. The great houses were shuttered or requisitioned. The concerns of who was sleeping with whom or which diamond tiara to wear to a ball suddenly seemed grotesquely trivial in the face of national survival. The war was a cataclysm, but for Loelia, it was also, paradoxically, a kind of liberation. It provided a cause, a purpose, something real and vital to hold on to, far removed from the suffocating emptiness of her marriage. While Bendor continued his political machinations in the background, Loelia threw herself into war work. She volunteered for the Red Cross, working in one of its London depots, packing parcels for prisoners of war. It was grueling, unglamorous work. She would spend long hours in cold warehouses, her hands raw from packing and lifting, alongside women from all classes of society, united by a common purpose. For the first time in her adult life, she was part of a team. For the first time, she was valued not for her title or her husband's wealth, but for her contribution, for the work of her own hands. She also worked as a driver, navigating the blacked-out, bomb-scarred streets of London, a city under constant threat. This experience was transformative. The shy, sheltered Duchess was now confronted with the raw, terrifying reality of the Blitz. She saw the devastation, the courage of ordinary Londoners, the quiet heroism of the emergency services. This immersion in real life, real struggle, and real consequence provided a powerful, clarifying perspective. After witnessing the life and death drama unfolding on the streets of her city, how could she possibly return to the pathetic, soul-destroying farce of her marriage? The war had not only given her a sense of purpose, it had given her a sense of her own strength and resilience. The woman who drove through the Blitz was not the same timid girl who had married the Duke of Westminster 17 years earlier. The breaking point was not a single dramatic event. It was the quiet, final collapse of a structure that had been rotting from within for years. It was the culmination of 17 years of loneliness, of thousands of small cuts and a handful of deep, savage wounds. It was the memory of a small dog being thrown from a window, of sitting at a dinner table opposite her husband's mistress, of being publicly blamed for a childless marriage, of enduring the suffocating weight of a title that had brought her nothing but misery. The war had shown her that a different kind of life was possible, a life of purpose and self-respect, free from the daily humiliation she had endured for so long. And so in 1947, after the war, Loelia made the bravest decision of her life. She decided to divorce the Duke of Westminster. In the 21st century, divorce is commonplace. In 1947, for a duchess, it was an earthquake. It was a public admission of failure, a tearing of the social fabric, an act of defiance against the entire edifice of class, duty, and tradition upon which her world was built. It meant relinquishing the name, the status, and the unimaginable wealth she had possessed for nearly 2 decades. Bendor, true to form, was not magnanimous in his defeat. He was a litigious and vengeful man, and while he could not prevent the divorce, he ensured the settlement was far from generous. Loelia was not left penniless, but she was forced to transition from a life of limitless, fantastical luxury to the more modest existence of a merely well-to-do woman. The private yachts, the armies of servants, the priceless jewels, many of which were Grosvenor heirlooms she was forced to return, all vanished. She walked away from Eaton Hall and Borden House and never looked back. She had to sell many of the personal jewels Bendor had given her to secure her financial independence. But this was not a loss. It was the price of her freedom. And she paid it gladly. She was no longer Her Grace, the Duchess of Westminster. She was once again Loelia Ponsonby. The world saw a duchess shedding her title, but Loelia felt a prisoner shedding her chains. The divorce was not an end, but a beginning. She had survived the gilded cage. She had survived the public humiliation and the private pain. She had walked out of the fairy tale, leaving the lonely monster behind in his castle. And now, for the first time since she was 19 years old, her life was her own. The great unanswered question was, what would she do with it? Freedom, when it finally came, was a quiet and profound readjustment. For 17 years, Loelia's life had been dictated by the whims of a volatile man and the rigid protocols of a ducal household. Now, at the age of 38, she was faced with the exhilarating and slightly daunting task of building a life entirely of her own design. She settled in a charming, far more modest house in the countryside, a world away from the oppressive grandeur of Eaton Hall. For the first time, she was able to create a home that was truly hers, filled with the light, elegant furniture she loved and surrounded by a garden she could tend with her own hands. The change in her circumstances was dramatic. She was no longer the mistress of limitless funds, and she had to learn a new, more careful way of life. She sold many of the extravagant jewels Bendor had given her, not with regret, but with a sense of liberation, casting off the glittering shackles of her past. This downsizing was not a social demotion. It was a conscious and joyful unburdening. She discovered that a life of relative simplicity, surrounded by genuine friends and her own cherished belongings, brought her a level of contentment that the endless opulence of her former life had never come close to providing. And then love entered her life, not the overwhelming, possessive, and ultimately destructive passion she had experienced with Bendor, but a gentler, truer, and far more enduring affection. In 1969, she married Sir Martin Lindsay, a man who was in many ways Bendor's antithesis. Lindsay was a decorated war hero, a polar explorer of some renown, and a member of Parliament. He was a man of substance, courage, and integrity, respected for his character and his achievements, not just his name. He was also a kind, steady, and devoted companion. Their marriage was a partnership of equals, built on a foundation of shared interests, mutual respect, and deep, quiet affection. With Martin, Loelia finally found the companionship and emotional security she had craved her entire life. They enjoyed a peaceful, contented life together, far from the glare of the society columns. Her second marriage was the happy ending her fairy tale should have had from the beginning, a powerful testament to her resilience and her capacity for hope. It proved definitively that her story was not defined by the man she had divorced, but by the happiness she had the courage to build for herself afterwards. Loelia's story does not exist in a vacuum. It serves as a crucial, deeply personal lens through which we can re-examine the powerful myths of her time. The first and most obvious of these is the character of her first husband, Bendor. Even today, there are conflicting interpretations of the man. To his admirers, and there were many, he was one of the last great Edwardian titans, a figure of immense charisma, energy, and patriotic spirit. Winston Churchill, his longtime friend, famously eulogized him as a glorious survivor from a vanished age of wealth and power. They saw his excesses as part of his magnificent, larger-than-life persona. But Loelia's story offers a devastating rebuttal to this romanticized view. Through her eyes, we see Bendor not as a glorious survivor, but as a monstrous egotist, a domestic tyrant whose charm was a weapon and whose generosity was a tool of control. Her account exposes the profound cruelty, the casual misogyny, and the moral emptiness that lay beneath his charismatic veneer. Her quiet testimony effectively puts the Duke on trial, and the verdict is damning. Her story forces us to question the very nature of power and privilege, suggesting that the great men of history are often anything but great in the confines of their own homes. More broadly, Loelia's life helps to dismantle the enduringly popular, heavily romanticized image of the British aristocracy. In the age of costume dramas that portray this world as one of noble tradition, witty banter, and elegant romance, Loelia's experience is a vital dose of reality. She reveals the dark side of the fairy tale, the emotional sterility, the suffocating pressure placed upon women to be decorative objects and producers of heirs, and the brutal social codes that demanded the hiding of all personal pain. Her memoir, Grace and Favor, is a subtle but powerful indictment of the system that produced her, a system that valued appearances above all else, often at a terrible human cost. After Bendor's death in 1953, the title passed to a cousin, and a new era for the Grosvenor dynasty began. But Loelia's story continued to resonate. In the 1950s and 60s, she entered the orbit of another brilliant, complex, and ultimately destructive figure, the writer Truman Capote. Capote was then at the height of his fame, and he was fascinated by the hidden lives of the ultra-rich. He cultivated a circle of elegant, high society women whom he called his swans. Loelia, with her impeccable lineage, her quiet elegance, and her incredible life story, was a perfect addition to his collection. They formed an unlikely friendship. Capote, the flamboyant, gossiping provocateur, and Loelia, the discreet, reserved former duchess. He was utterly captivated by her experiences. Here was a woman who had seen the system from the absolute inside and had managed to escape. It is widely believed that she became one of his key sources for his planned magnum opus, the scandalous tell-all novel Answered Prayers. In their long, boozy lunches, the woman who had been trained her entire life in the art of discretion finally found a rapt audience for her story. One can only imagine the tales she told, the secrets she shared with the one man who was guaranteed to understand and to appreciate their shocking, gossipy brilliance. It was perhaps her final quiet act of revenge to have her truth recorded by the greatest social chronicler of the age. So why does Loelia's story still matter today? Why should we care about the unhappy marriage of a duchess who died decades ago? Because her story is a timeless and universal one. It is a profound cautionary tale about the seductive but ultimately hollow promise that money, status, and beauty can buy happiness. It is a story that resonates with anyone who has ever felt trapped in a situation they felt powerless to change, or has had to project an image of contentment while feeling desperately alone. Her lasting significance lies in her quiet courage. Her greatest achievement was not becoming the Duchess of Westminster. It was finding the strength to stop being the Duchess of Westminster. In an era when women of her class were expected to endure, she chose to escape. She chose her own sanity and self-respect over a life of unimaginable privilege. Her legacy is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the idea that it is never too late to rewrite your own story, to walk out of the cage and into the light. Loelia Ponsonby's life was a study in contrast, a fairy tale stitched with thorns, a public spectacle of a deeply private sorrow. She was born into a world of immense privilege that demanded the suppression of self, and she married into a world of limitless wealth that brought her profound loneliness. For 17 years, she played the part of the perfect Duchess, her grace and poise, a mask for her heartbreak. But her story is not in the end a tragedy. It is a story of quiet, determined survival. It is the story of a woman who found, within the cold confines of her gilded cage, the strength to build a world of her own, and eventually, the courage to break free. She learned the hard way that the grandest titles and the most dazzling jewels are worthless currency in the economy of human happiness. Her true triumph was not the day she gained a coronet, but the day she found the courage to lay it aside. Loelia, Duchess of Westminster, showed the world a life of glittering misery. But Loelia Lindsay, the woman she became, showed us something far more valuable: a life of quiet, hard-won, and deeply cherished contentment. She simply wanted to be happy, and in the end, against all odds, she was.